This is a Stories to be Told podcast. Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of Stories to be Told, the podcast series. I'm Tracy DW, founder and creator of Stories to be Told, an online multimedia educational hub aimed at engaging all learners from 9 years and up interested in understanding more about the history of the British Empire, otherwise known as Britain's colonial past. If this is your first time joining us, I want to give you a huge welcome to our podcast series and our growing community. And if you're a regular listener and you've come back for more, then I'm thrilled and delighted that you're still here. The listenership is growing, and you are all definitely making a call to action to spread the word, which was the focus of my last episode. For those of you who are new, Stories to be Told is not just about a podcast series or the website. It's also about providing a balance of perspective on history, as what is often presented as fact always needs to be balanced with another perspective. And whatever you've heard or been told about history, there's always another story and many perspectives related to it. And my podcasts are all about discussing and exploring some of those perspectives. Now, as I always clarify in every episode, my podcasts do not aim to be the ultimate or only authority on the subject or topic under discussion. I'd just like to share what I've learned, and I hope that it will provide enough information to stimulate your own curiosity to find out more by beginning your own learning journey about the subject and decide for yourself if history is a matter of fact or perspective. This podcast complements a future poetic narrative to be published about the Industrial Revolution. Now, several people have asked me, when are we going to see more published stories or poetic narratives, as I like to call them? Well, I currently have 4 published titles: Caribbean Wind, a celebration of the arrival of H.M. Windrush in 1948 and the Windrush generation; Caribbean Rush, which is an account of England's early encounter with the Caribbean; Knights at the Round Table, the Berlin Conference of 1884, which tells of the scramble for Africa; and Gone with the Wind, Macmillan's Speech for Change, about Prime Minister Harold Macmillan's speech in 1960, which was prophetic of the rise of nationalism and the end of Britain's empire. These are all available in ebook, Kindle and paperback formats at storiestobetold.com and Amazon. I'm pleased to announce that more titles will be published later on in the year, with mini documentaries, learning journeys and artwork for our alternative history gallery. And of course, I will be sharing some anecdotes and some readings from these through another couple of Story So Far podcast episodes, okay? In this podcast, I decided to focus on the period of the Industrial Revolution, not just simply because I had written a poetic narrative about this period, I'll come back to that in a moment, but because the Victorian era has to be one of the 3 most popular and most studied topics within the history curriculum in primary schools. The other 2 topics are the Tudor monarchs and World War II. Both of the latter topics I have spoken about and referred to in previous podcast episodes. So if this is the first episode that you're listening to and you want to find out more about what I mention and refer to in terms of World War II and the Tudor monarchs, then I suggest that when you've finished listening to this episode, go back to the first episode in the series and start listening and work your way through each episode until you get to this episode. And then you're all up to date. Now, from my perspective, the reason for these topics being given such an intense focus is because it represents what I come to refer to as the golden ages of British history, which provide a factual account that is very Eurocentric. The Tudors marked England's transition from medieval to modern. Queen Victoria's reign was seen as a time of British invention and innovation, and World War II is always celebrated as a victory against fascism by the British and Allied forces. Each topic is factually accurate within its own merit. However, for a long time, and certainly from when I was at school, these topics reinforced a narrative that nothing else in history was worth studying, and were not taught in a way that provides a context into understanding Britain's colonial activities, omitting any representation and contribution of people of other ethnicities and their place in history. There is a colonial narrative that runs through all three of these topics. In the Tudors, we saw the beginnings of the navy and fortified ports due to England's breakaway from the Roman Catholic Church, and because of this, England was ready to go off exploring. Britain experienced the height of its colonial powers with the British Raj in India during Victoria's reign, and World War II signalled the decline of the empire when India became an independent state 2 years later and Ghana followed in 1957. So there is a clear arc that Britain's colonial activity follows through these three topics. So, I come back to the poetic narrative that this podcast complements. In calling the podcast Victorian Revolutionaries, I want to try and go some way towards presenting a perspective that addresses the underrepresentation of Africans and people of other ethnicities during this period, and present them as revolutionaries as they navigated, negotiated, and reinvented their way through what was a major transition from enslavement towards emancipation. By 1837, Queen Victoria had inherited an England that was far different to that of any of her predecessors. Even though the slave trade had been abolished throughout the empire in 1833, it had left an indelible legacy not only on England, now the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, but had also left an impact on Africa, the Caribbean, and the Indian subcontinent. Over the previous 200 years, England had amassed a huge fortune from the trading of cash crops via Caribbean and American plantations in exchange for commodities in Europe and resources and slave labour from Africa. However, precious metals were becoming more prevalent within the trade transaction, and as the seizure of Constantinople by the Turks in 1453 could be perceived as a catalyst for European discovery of new trade routes, the use of precious metals in trade would also become a catalyst for change in trading relations between England and other countries, especially China. What was the Industrial Revolution? Let's get into some core knowledge. It is the period between 1760 and 1840 where the transatlantic slave trade financed and enabled the production of raw materials and established the markets to sell them. The conversion of iron to steel and the use of coal was needed to manufacture these raw materials into goods. This, together with the inventions of machinery that could mass produce farm crops and enable a more efficient use of land through crop rotation, saw a mass migration of human labour from rural environments to the towns, cities and ports where factories had developed and where work was more readily available. This was the chain effect which led from fodder crops to animal husbandry to the creation of textiles and currency, which increased demand for mining of precious metals. Why did the Industrial Revolution begin in Britain? Well, the scramble for Africa through the Berlin Conference 1884 had not yet happened, and India had not yet become a crown colony until 1858. But it was still under the control of the British East India Company. However, Britain had already claimed enough territory across the world, and colonialism became an ideology which imposed a value system and culture across these territories. The invention of the railway connecting these foreign territories transcontinentally enabled Britain to exploit these territories in terms of their labour and natural resources. And how did the Industrial Revolution change patterns in world trade? Although the early 1800s was marked by mass European migration to America, developed countries were able to manufacture a range of goods and products, while more rural countries were only able, and sometimes forced, to produce only one crop. This turned these countries into banana republics, susceptible to even the slightest fluctuation in international markets. It was Britain and other European countries who often owned and profited from these crops, leaving countries across Africa, the Caribbean and South America with no money to invest into infrastructure to develop their own economy. This enabled developed countries to sustain their own further development, making their currency of more value than that of the countries where the gold reserves reside upon which those currencies are based. This created the inequalities and imbalances that we see today. The process of the underdevelopment of these countries and the use of the terminology Third World. After the abolishment of slavery, Britain passed new trading laws with countries who wanted to continue to trade within its colonies. These new trading laws were an attempt to find alternatives to trading for slaves. However, the early Victorian era marked a shift away from Africa, the Caribbean and America, and focused on Britain's colony within Ireland. And I talk more about England's earlier attempts to colonise Ireland in an earlier podcast episode, What Do We Know About Edward Colston? The Great Irish Famine, 1845-52, was a microcosm of the potato famine that was sweeping across Europe at the same time. The consequences of the famine were twofold. Firstly, single crop dependence and absentee landlordism exacerbated the tragedy and created further strained relationships between the Irish and ruling British government. This resulted in 1 million deaths and caused just as many to migrate, resulting in a 25% decrease in the Irish population. This further highlighted the deep division between nationalism and republican sentiment. The Catholic Irish in southern Ireland and the Protestant English occupying the north, a division and conflict that would play out into the next century. Secondly, the potato crop famine saw Europe implode spectacularly as it triggered mass starvation, migration and civil unrest in the revolutions of 1848. These saw serfdom and the traditional monarchical structures, part of which was referred to as the divine right of kings, removed by a wave of democratic and liberal movements. This was due to demands from the common people, referred to as the working class, for greater participation in the governing of their own country. This revolution affected as much as 50 countries across Europe, but Britain seemed relatively unaffected. What could possibly be reasons for this? From my perspective, I think this related to why the Industrial Revolution probably started in Britain first. The profitable triangle and the British Raj in India, established for almost the previous 2 centuries, financed a formidable navy, a flourishing middle class, and a strong parliamentary government with laws to protect trading and financial interests. I talk more in depth about this transformation in my previous podcast episode, The Pink Map Project, The Ultimate Paradox. Improved rail and road transportation allowed Britain to link up its territories cohesively. Poverty was still an issue, but the rise in manufacturing meant that the distribution of labour was far more evenly distributed as rural workers migrated to towns and cities. Now, it could be suggested that the lack of this type of progression seen in England towards industrialism in other parts of Europe could have been one of the causes for the mass social unrest in these countries. A preoccupation with accumulating wealth through exploiting foreign territories may have meant that other countries across Europe had actually ignored their own domestic problems, and these were left unaddressed. So, who were the Victorian Revolutionaries that this podcast is about, and what were they doing at this time? It is a fact that the African presence in England was well established and had been so for hundreds of years, and the Industrial Revolution saw the end to the demands for mass labour and mass enslavement of Africans and people of other ethnicities. The experiences of Africans on either side of the Atlantic during this industrial era were similar, but within differing contexts and had different outcomes. From the 1650s to the 1790s, many Africans were brought to England from its African and Caribbean colonies and sold through auctions at ports, just like their counterparts in America. However, unlike the American colonies where Africans were subjected to the brutalities of life on the plantations, Africans in England often became an object of fashion or a social statement for their owners. Young children were often treated as pages, companions, or even pets. The reality that the royal family, members of Parliament and the British aristocracy all had Africans as members of their household is now a part of Britain's colonial past that is being studied within the mainstream more and more, and I encourage you to go on your own learning journey to find out about this. Now, I propose that there were 2 types of revolution taking place between 1760 and 1840. The first was a revolution of thought and mindset regarding freedom and equality for Africans. The campaign for emancipation and abolition ignited through the African communities that gradually developed during the 1780s, especially within London and other cities across England. These communities found their voices through figures such as Ignatius Santos, Mary Prince, Olaudah Equiano, and performers who developed a kind of celebrity status, such as Pablo Fanquet. Across the Atlantic, Africans in America contributed towards a second revolution as inventors. Andrew J. Beard invented a flour mill, a rotary engine, and 2 types of plough, as well as the Jenny Coupler, used to lock train carriages together, making rail travel and transportation safer. Henry Blair invented a planter for corn and cotton seeds. John Barker patented a portable tobacco screw press for cutting tobacco, while Norbert Rillieux invented a vacuum evaporator for refining sugar. These are just a few examples of the contributions of Africans toward industry and technology, as it would have been natural for them to invent solutions to problems that they experienced through having to cope with the immense workload that plantation life imposed. However, many of them were unable to obtain patents for their inventions due to their enslaved status, But again, I encourage you to go on your own learning journey about the inventions of Africans and people of other ethnicities and gain a balance of perspective for yourself. Both these groups of revolutionaries on both sides of the Atlantic came together through historical events where Africans gained their freedom through the Abolition Acts of 1807 and 1833 and through service as army and naval officers during the American War of Independence in 1775 to 83, the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, the War of 1812 and the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. It was during these decades that Africans came together and formed communities within the ports of Britain and through settlements in other territories within Britain's empire. You can listen to my previous episode, The Book of Negroes, How Africa Came to Nova Scotia, for more information about this, and what became of the legacy of these Victorian revolutionaries. As Africans settling in ports around Britain, in Liverpool, Cardiff and Bristol, they intermarried with the English population and established new communities. Finding out about the early African population and their communities is difficult due to censor documents during Victorian times showing no record of ethnic background. However, some councils do possess evidence of the African presence through other records. Those whom we do know of were the beginning of a great narrative about the African presence in Britain during Britain's colonial past that we are learning more about every day. Figures such as John O'Cansey, Sister Frida, Emma Clark, Fanny Eaton, and Thomas Birch Freeman will soon become part of the vernacular for the African diaspora here in Britain, in the same way that Mary Seacole and Samuel Coleridge Taylor have become. Before I come to the end of this podcast, as you know, I always like to leave some questions for further thought and discussion. What other ethnic communities also settled in Britain at this time, and what were the circumstances surrounding their migration to the country? What other sources can we use to find out more about the African presence in Britain during its colonial past? The African diaspora must take greater responsibility to preserve their presence and not blame others for owning or erasing it. Do you agree or disagree with this statement, and why? If you like this podcast, you can stay on my website or this listening platform and check out my other podcasts related to this episode, such as The Book of Negroes, as I mentioned before, How Africa Came to Nova Scotia, which sheds more light on the experiences of the African diaspora after the American War of Independence. You can visit storiestobetold.com for mini documentaries, our alternative history gallery, and suggested learning journeys, all linked to the content of my work. And finally, don't forget what I like to call the heart and soul of the Stories to be Told movement, my stories or poetic narratives, Caribbean Wind, Caribbean Rush, Knights at the Round Table, the Berlin Conference 1884, and Gone with the Wind, Macmillan's Speech for Change. As I've mentioned earlier in this episode, they are all available on the website in both ebook, Kindle and paperback formats. Feel free to like, follow and share me on Facebook and Instagram, and visit the website to join our mailing list where you'll be updated with events, promotional offers and future releases. It is a pleasure and privilege to share my learning journey with you as always in this podcast and in every previous podcast in this series, and I encourage you to either begin or continue your own learning journey about Britain's colonial past. History is a matter of fact or perspective. Thanks so much for listening again, and I'll see you on the next page. Stay safe. and bye-bye for now.